The 2012 Olympics were hailed as the People's Games, a sporting festival that would help regenerate some of the poorest parts of London. But as costs rocket from 2.3 to over 12 billion pounds and corporate sponsorship dominates the Games, who will actually profit from the London Olympics? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Well, up to 2/3 of the tickets for the prestige events have been given to Olympic bodies and corporate sponsors. Many roads will be closed off only for the use of VIPs. At venues, a bottle of water will cost £1.60, and if you want a burger, that'll set you back nearly £6. So, is the Olympics celebrating the common man, or is it simply a showcase for corporate greed? Well, before we find out what the people of London think, here's a short video clip.
The last time the Olympic Games came to London was in 1948, a time of economic crisis in a world torn by 6 years of conflict when the capital lay bombed out in ruins. Yet the Austerity Games, as it later came to be known, was also hailed as the most successful, inexpensive and unpretentious games of the 20th century, encapsulating the true meaning of the international sporting spirit. This year, again, the Games come to London, again hailed as the People's Games and again in a time of austerity. But this time it comes with a great deal more investment and corporate extravagance. The London Olympics organisers claim their mammoth £12 billion investment will regenerate East London, but critics fear it will only create an island of prosperity amid rundown neighbourhoods and favour a culture of elitism. The Counter Olympics network say what's actually being created is a rich enclave like Canary Wharf, the complex of banks and expensive apartments a short distance from the Olympic Park. Instead of turning the Olympic Village into a place of civic benefit, organisers have sold it to the Qatari royal family and a firm of private developers. What's more, the infrastructure is highly specialised and built to the requirements of the organisers rather than the needs of Londoners. So £40 million will be spent on a basketball arena and £19 million on a water polo venue, both of which will be demolished once the Olympics are over. Tensions have also been soaring over claims of worker abuse in countries such as Bangladesh, where official Olympic outfitters such as Nike and Adidas are using sweatshops to produce uniforms for UK teams. While the Olympic organisers hail the Games as sustainable, their two chief sponsors carry the image of some of the worst ecological damage caused by corporations in the last year. BP was responsible for the oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, and EDF was involved in the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown. Attending the Games is also outside the reach of many Londoners. Prestige tickets, which include a champagne reception, 3-course dinner and free bar, are available at a price of £1,800 a seat at the Athletic Stadium. Part of the London Road network is to be closed off to regular traffic in order to allow VIPs to travel from their 5-star hotels to Olympic venues. Celebrities and chief executives of major companies will also be escorted along the Thames in high-powered inflatable boats. David Cameron claims the Olympics are not an expensive luxury in tough times, but amid widespread unavailability of Olympic tickets, further demands on taxpayers and disruption to public services, could the London Olympics trigger more discontent rather than a sense of sportsmanship?
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking people what they know about the funding for the Olympic Games. Where's the money coming from?
I think most of the money is coming from government. It's due to start up later this month. It's been an ongoing discussion that we've seen internationally.
What do you know about how the London Olympics are funded, and who's actually funding them?
It's a combination of private sponsorship and a lot of money from the taxpayer, people like me.
I think that taxpayers and the government fund the Olympics, and they're the ones who make the Olympics possible.
I presume I'm paying for them. That's why they're funded because I'm a UK taxpayer. So and they're funded by me and by the commercial sponsors, I guess.
What do you know about how the London Olympics are being funded and where the money's coming from?
Well, the money's mostly tax funded, from my understanding, and also there is some private investment, and the private investment will be going in and will be coming back out after the Olympics is done, mainly through the accommodation, I believe, which will be the athletes' accommodation, which will then be converted into private residential housing, and that's how the private investment will come back out, and also some government investment.
Well, I know that they've been largely funded by the taxpayer with a large input by the government, and although they say they're coming in at budget, I have my doubts as to whether they actually are.
Who do you think will benefit?
The people around the stadiums and maybe the people that are running them, but certainly not the general public, but it's just my view, I suppose.
I think retailers will make a profit in the long term. London itself overall should make a profit, so hotels, leisure venues, whatever else it might be. England overall may or may not. I think it's all about London. You could argue that London's already quite a famous city, so it's not exactly needing the publicity.
The government mainly. The people definitely wouldn't profit. I'm almost certain about that.
Who do you think will benefit financially from it, though? And certainly from £12 billion, at least, of the public purse being invested in it.
It's hard to say. The corporate sponsors will benefit, I'm sure they will. I would hope that the people of London, in particular people of East London, will benefit from it. Whether that's guaranteed or not, I've no idea. Sometimes Olympics work for the cities where they've been held, such as in Barcelona. Sometimes they don't.
I think shopkeepers, like the hotel industry, service industry, restaurants, those kind of people will definitely benefit. But I also think Londoners will benefit just from the vibe as well as the monetary aspect.
Different views there from the public here on the streets of London. Let's now see what our experts think.
Nearly all the money comes from the taxpayer. Corporate sponsors will contribute about 700 million, but they will get 600 million back in tax rebates. Of course, they will raise money from tickets, and then the rest of it basically is taxpayers' money. Some of it has come from the lottery, which means that they've actually taken money from other charities, from events which are children's sport, arts funding and so on, which has been diverted into the Olympics. This is about an alliance between the IOC, which is a corporation itself, it's a brand, and corporations, big corporations, which are they're going to pay money, but they're also going to get a lot of money back in terms of their broadcasting their product around the world. So that's the way that which they see this event. And of course there are construction companies which have been involved in putting up the stadiums and so on. So those are the people that make the money. The corporations will profit because they get their brands known around the world. There are companies that have been involved in construction, so they make a profit out of it. It's also tied up with property because the Olympics requires the taking over a large piece of land, and that's been compulsorily purchased. And so the long-term objective, of course, also is to create new profits for the property industry, and that's integral to the project.
Originally we were told that this was going to be joint funded between the public and kind of corporate sponsors of the Olympics. We thought that it was originally going to cost around £2 billion for the public. That's now spiralled up to around 13 billion. And that's covering all the venues, all the logistics, all that kind of stuff. There's a separate organisation which is kind of actually doing the running of the Olympics themselves, and that is largely funded by the corporate sponsors. Yet that is only costing around 2 billion. So you can see the vast majority of the money for the Olympics is really coming from taxpayers, not from the actual sponsors themselves. The people who profit the most from the Olympics are the corporate sponsors, from the enormous sponsorship deals and what that allows them to do in terms of their outdoor advertising, but also all the laws that have been brought in. So you have the brand exclusion zones around the Olympics, the fact that there will essentially be these monopoly rights both on advertising but also for the actual companies themselves. So for example, Visa being the only card that can be used there, the entire games are now being geared up to essentially deliver enormous profits for these corporate sponsors, and it's definitely not something we're going to see real benefits for the local communities at all. I mean, this is kind of the model that the Olympics has now come to. Instead of this being a celebration of the kind of the fundamental principles and the fundamental values of the Olympics about things like fair play and respect, those kind of things are now being lost, and what we're instead seeing is a big taxpayer funded, essentially corporate bonanza for this huge range of companies that get to associate themselves with the Olympics, which in itself is quite shocking, but at the moment it's even more shocking when we're in a time of austerity. We're seeing massive public service cuts, and instead we're now seeing, as I said, up to £13 billion being spent on this enormous event, which is providing very, very little for local communities, but an enormous amount for the corporate sponsors.
The cost of funding the Olympics has skyrocketed, while private sector funders have evaporated, leaving the government holding the bill. The National Audit Office noted that private sector contributions have dwindled to less than 2% of the total. Yet corporations like McDonald's and Coca-Cola are set to profit hugely from the Games. Is that fair?
Every piece of sport is like that these days. There's a sort of ruling cabal who take a fair slice of the money of running all the organisations that have something to gain from taking part in the Olympics.
The Olympics, as we've said, is paid for by the taxpayers. Only 2%, by the way, is from private funding. Yet it appears, when you look at it, that it's sort of showcasing McDonald's, Coca-Cola, all the large corporations. Is that fair on the public purse in Britain?
I think it's probably the way it is in 2012 that the large conglomerates basically run the show, don't they? I think all corporate sponsors run everything. So.
Because that's how things seem to work these days. We seem to have got right away from public. It is all multi-million-dollar corporations, and I'm very sad that this is how it works.
Isn't that what always happens, really? That's the way always things are. The saddest thing that I think would happen after the Olympics is everything that's invested in all the stadiums and facilities will eventually, people, even though they have already paid with their tax money for it, they will have to pay to get into the facilities and use them.
Do you think there's a certain irony, though, that perhaps £12 billion of public money has gone into the Olympics, and yet to the onlooker it appears that it's corporations like McDonald's, like Coca-Cola, like Cadbury's, all the big sponsors who seem to be benefiting from it in terms of their image making?
No, that doesn't bother me so much. I mean, that's the way of life. Corporate sponsors are necessary for events of this size. That's fine. I think what's important, though, is that people in London feel that they own the Olympics and that they feel they can get tickets to the Olympics and they can experience and take part in the event. As long as they can do that alongside the corporate sponsorship involvement, then that's fine.
Because they will be providing a lot of the services which will get some of the direct revenue streams from the people that will be coming to London. So I guess it just makes sense that they will be the ones that will profit.
Some unions are planning to strike during the Olympics. Do you think they should be allowed to strike during an event like that?
No, not at all. It doesn't help anyone, does it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the biggest audience, right? So it's why not?
I think that they have the right to protest, but not now. I think that the city is under a lot of stress and a lot of people, and a lot of the roads are even changing to suit the Olympics. So I think they should save it for another time, but they should express their opinions.
Well, those were the views of the people here on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
A protest is legal, so of course they're right to protest. The Olympics is not an event, that should require people to suspend normal life. Of course it does, because life will be people will be greatly inconvenienced, and in the case of some transport unions, they'll be working extra hours. But of course they're right. Yes, this is a democratic society, and so people have a right to protest. And the idea that you shouldn't be able to go on strike just because you have an event like this is ridiculous. Of course, politicians object to people going on strike, and businesses don't like people going on strike. But if you want to make your point, sometimes you have to do that at a time when it's inconvenient to other people. The people who are going to go on strike will be criticised, and that's always the case. But, for example, TfL bosses are also receiving large bonuses, much larger than the workers who are claiming an extra £500 or something like that. We're talking about, I think it's £8,000 for TfL bosses who are going to be managing this process. And other people will be making money. So why exactly transport workers, who are going to do longer hours, shouldn't be able to expect to get a bit more money for what they're going to do? It's difficult to understand. As an elite event, mega events do not actually stimulate sport participation. So you have a situation in which the Games were sold on the idea that it would stimulate young people, in particular, inspire young people to participate. Actually, participation among young people has gone down. And so you have a situation in which really this is about bums on seats. This is about how many tickets you can sell to the world, because this is media rights. So if you're asking people to watch an event on TV, they're not going to be participating. And actually, in many ways, people feel quite intimidated by these high-powered athletes. So they don't really feel necessarily they can emulate them. So you create a spectator culture around these events. So the kind of elite nature of this event creates this lack of interest in some ways. And it's tied in with the fact that this is a money-making event. So because you're talking about media rights, people watching the event and creating it's part of the sort of consumer culture, and sport is part of being, as something which you consume. This, for the future, I'm afraid, is not going to produce a healthier, fitter society. On the contrary, the evidence is that it tends to do exactly the opposite. Back in 2002, the government had a report called Game Plan, which said you will not receive benefits from the Olympics. And so you have to ask what were they up to. And the first thing you have to say is that this is about property, taking over a large piece of land in East London for property development. So the IOC requires that you build this large park. So in the process, you have to compulsorily purchase the land. So you have opportunities for property development. And that's very explicitly stated by the authorities back in 2003. And then you also have, of course, this competition which is going on between major cities. And we have this enormous security display, most of which is completely irrelevant to security. Having a massive ship in the Thames, for example, HMS Ocean, does nothing for security. So this is a display of state power, you might say, state capacity to show off. And cities are involved in the competition, New York, Paris, Berlin, wherever it is, in order to try and capture corporations. They want them to come and settle up in Britain. So it is about that display. It's about advertising themselves. And you were asking earlier on about protest. I mean, I'm part of another group which will be organising a protest on the 28th of July. And we title that as being a protest against the corporate Olympics, because that is the way that we really see this event. It's part of that kind of global culture, globalisation, and London is competing in that market. And that is what we would be protesting about.
I think it's absolutely vital that people have the right to protest during and around the Olympics. When the Olympics were being held in China, there was an enormous amount of fuss in the mainstream media in the UK over the right to protest, the designated protest zones, and the kind of civil liberties issues. Yet now that they're being hosted in London, we're actually seeing many of the same things being brought in here. A real curtailment of people's civil liberties, cracking down on the right to protest. But it's absolutely fundamental, these key issues around corporate power, around the role of the sponsors, around the local communities, that people are able to express that. So I think it's absolutely right and vital that people can protest around the Olympics this year. The official sponsors of London 2012 does almost read like a roll call of some of the world's least ethical companies. So you have like BP with their involvement in Deepwater Horizon, Dow and Bhopal, and then also Adidas, who have around 750,000 people working for them around the world, largely in very poor working conditions, working excessive hours, very, very low pay, and with very little union organisation or ability to defend their rights. And it's very clear actually that these kind of ethical considerations around the business practices is just really not something that goes into the decision around who gets a sponsor. Essentially, the Olympic rings and being able to associate yourselves with the Olympics is just simply up for the highest bidder. So we've seen some concern from the London organisers. In fact, in some ways, they've gone further than any organiser before to actually start looking at some of these ethical issues. So, for example, they've now got a supplier code of practice that says there should be various standards that all their suppliers should meet. But in practice, we've seen that pretty much ignored. There's been very little work on implementation, and it only focuses on specific Olympic products. So, for example, with Adidas, the workers who make tracksuits with the Olympic rings on should be paid, for example, a living wage that covers their basic needs. But it does nothing for all the other workers that make Adidas products, even though Adidas is going to benefit across all of its products, not just the Olympic ones. So what we're seeing is a really selective approach rather than something that actually looks at what these businesses are like, what their business practices are like across the board, and doing something much more fundamental that actually looks about what those values are, which is what we think the Olympics should be doing. And I think we heard a lot when this bid went in about the legacy of the Games, about what it was going to do for East London and communities, but that really doesn't fit with a lot of what the model of the modern Olympics is, which is about creating an event for the corporations. So instead what we're seeing is an event that delivers brand exclusion zones, that delivers monopoly rights to various companies, that allows these companies huge benefit, but actually isn't really built to deliver for the local community. So instead you're seeing local football pitches and green spaces actually now being ripped up and tarmacked to make way for the facilities for the Olympics. So instead we're going to have giant stadiums that don't really seem like they can have a lot of use, whereas the community facilities, which are much more important, are instead being destroyed. So I think there's a massive mismatch between what we originally sold and instead what we're seeing delivered.
Several of the official sponsors of the Olympics are involved in unethical practices, such as running sweatshops in developing countries. So why are the organisers of the Olympics working with such companies? And will this corporate mentality tarnish the legacy of the so-called People's Games? Several of the official sponsors have been linked to unethical practices, for example, running sweatshops in Southeast Asia. Human rights groups have voiced their concerns. Do you think that the Olympic organisers have been sufficiently sensitive to the corporate policies of some of these sponsors?
I think there's lots of skeletons in closets for many corporate organisations. So I think only certain businesses can actually afford to pay this sort of money and benefit from this sort of money. So it really, you have to ring fence around certain organisations. So I think they're always going to be those organisations.
I don't think they've done their homework sufficiently. I think they should have done. This should have been a factor to consider way from the start. This has only come up relatively late in the game, and I don't think it's right. I think they should have done their homework and got proper sourcing.
Because that's the only way they could have made funding. There's every company of a size that would agree to sponsor something of this size practices unethical practice.
Do you think that the spirit of the Olympics is being kind of lost in a way in amongst all the corporations and the financing and the wealth and the roads being shut for VIPs and all of this, and that it doesn't really celebrate the common man anymore in the way that it did in the ancient Athens?
Yeah, I do agree with that massively. I think the VIPs, they shouldn't really get treated any differently from any of us. I mean, we're the ones that are paying for it at the end of the day, aren't we? The VIPs might pay a little bit more tax on what they earn, but we should all be part of it.
I don't know. That's the straight answer on that. There's always going to be an impact on anything, right? But there's always going to be a success. So, there's going to be sort of pluses and minuses on everything. I think it will be the people, like everything in life, you always remember the good things and the bad things sort of kind of fizzle away, or the uncomfortable things. So
it is not anymore the games of the people. Absolutely not. It is who pays more money. It's all about the money. It used to be about the sport. Now it's all about the money and how much money would the government profit afterwards. It's all about the cash.
Well, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, get in touch via the email address below. Meanwhile, that's all from me. Bye-bye for now.